The shoreline stretched in a long, quiet curve where the land met the sea without resistance. The tide had drawn back further than expected, leaving behind a wide expanse of damp sand that held a faint sheen beneath the muted sky. The surface was mostly smooth, interrupted only by soft, uneven ridges shaped by the retreating water. In some places, the sand held its form. In others, it had already begun to settle, flattening slowly as the air moved over it. A light breeze passed across the shore. It did not shift anything in particular. It moved without urgency, touching the water in the distance and the open ground beneath the group with the same quiet consistency. Brenna walked at the front, her steps steady and unforced. Each step pressed lightly into the sand before easing back at the edges. She did not slow or quicken her pace. The ground was even, and she moved with it. Edrin followed behind, his robes brushing softly as he walked. The satchel at his side rested without movement. His attention moved across the shoreline without settling on any one detail. Kayla walked nearer to the edge, where the sand darkened with moisture. Her gaze moved across the ground as she went, pausing briefly on small fragments left behind by the tide. Thin strands of seaweed, broken shells, and scattered stones. Thomas remained slightly behind the others. A faint glow rested near him, subtle enough that it did not change the light of the shore. It remained constant as he walked, present but unobtrusive. The sound of the water was distant. Gentle waves moved somewhere beyond the wide stretch of exposed ground, their rhythm softened by the space between. No one spoke. The shoreline did not require it. The quiet held without effort, and the group moved within it without disturbing its stillness. A seabird crossed overhead, its call brief and unhurried. It passed from one end of the sky to the other without circling, then disappeared into the distance. The sand shifted slightly as they continued, darker where it remained damp, lighter where it had already begun to dry. The change was gradual, noticeable only in passing. Kayla slowed for a moment, her gaze resting on a stretch of ground where faint lines curved across the surface. They followed no clear pattern, though they suggested the movement of water that had only recently withdrawn. She remained still for a moment longer, then continued without comment. Edrin's attention passed briefly in the same direction. Though he did not stop, the lines remained as they were, part of the shoreline without distinction. Brenna stepped over a narrow channel where a thin stream of water traced its way slowly back toward the sea. The surface reflected the sky in broken shapes, shifting slightly as she passed. Thomas followed after, pausing just long enough to watch the movement of the water before continuing on. The distance between them remained quiet and understood. No one moved ahead or fell behind. Each step carried the same steady rhythm. The shoreline extended forward without interruption. There were no markers, no signs of recent passage, only the wide stretch of sand and the distant sound of the tide. Kayla's gaze moved once more toward the waterline. the edge felt further away than expected. Not by enough to notice at first, but enough to remain. The breeze shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and something softer beneath it, difficult to place and just as easily forgotten. Nothing in the moment required attention. The shore remained as it was, and the group continued across it, their movement steady as the distant tide waited somewhere beyond view. The shoreline continued without interruption, the same quiet stretch of damp sand extending ahead of them. The distance to the water remained longer than it had first appeared, though nothing about it called for urgency. The tide had drawn back further than expected, not dramatically, only enough that the space between land and sea felt slightly extended. Brenna continued forward at the same steady pace. Her steps left soft impressions that held for a moment before settling. The ground remained firm beneath her, unchanged in its consistency. Edrin walked just behind, his gaze drifting toward the distant waterline. It didn't move closer as quickly as it should have. The waves remained where they were, quiet and far. Kayla slowed again, her attention resting on the exposed ground. The patterns in the sand became more varied the further they walked. Shallow curves, faint ridges, and subtle depressions formed shapes that did not fully repeat. She crouched briefly near one of the impressions. It was not deep, not distinct, but it held its shape longer than the surrounding sand. She did not touch it. After a moment, she stood and continued walking. Thomas remained at the rear, his presence unchanged. The faint glow near him moved with the same quiet steadiness. His gaze followed the length of the shoreline, not searching, only observing. The air felt the same. The wind remained light. The sound of the sea did not change, and yet the distance between shore and water remained quietly out of place. No one spoke. Brenna stepped across another shallow channel, where water traced a slow path back toward the sea. This one was wider than the last, though just as calm. The surface shifted gently, reflecting the sky in broken fragments. Edrin paused briefly at its edge, watching the way the water moved without direction. After a moment, he stepped across and continued on. Kayla remained nearer to the darker sand, where the moisture held longer. Small pools had begun to appear more frequently now, scattered across the surface in uneven intervals. The ground between them felt less continuous, interrupted in subtle ways. She looked into one as she passed. The reflection was clear, but shallow. Beneath the surface, the sand appeared slightly darker. She moved on without stopping. Thomas followed last, his attention passing over the same pool without pause. The faint glow near him did not reach the surface. The shoreline continued to stretch ahead. The waterline remained distant. The space between them held steady in its quiet extension. The group moved forward within it, their pace unchanged, as the shore revealed nothing more than what it already held. The shoreline continued in the same quiet rhythm, though the ground beneath their steps began to change in small, uneven ways. At first, it was difficult to notice. The sand still held its soft, damp texture. The wind remained light. The distant sound of the sea did not shift. But beneath the surface, something began to take form. Brenna stepped forward without pause, though her path adjusted slightly as the ground became less uniform. The sand no longer settled in the same smooth stretches. It rose and dipped in subtle variations, as if something lay just beneath it. Edrin followed, his gaze lowering more often now, tracing the uneven ground ahead. The impressions left by their steps no longer formed as cleanly. In some places, the surface held. In others, it gave slightly, revealing a firmness beneath the sand that had not been there before. Kayla slowed, her attention narrowing. A shape interrupted the sand ahead. Not large, not distinct, but it held its edge in a way the surrounding ground did not. She approached it without urgency, stopping just short of where the sand thinned across its surface. The shape beneath was not smooth. It rose slightly, just enough to break the continuity of the ground. A faint line traced along one side, straight in a way that the shoreline hadn't been. She did not reach for it. Instead, she remained still, allowing the shape to exist without definition. After a moment, she stepped around it and continued forward. Thomas passed it last, his gaze lingering only briefly. The faint glow near him rested across the surface without changing it. The line remained where it was, unchanged by observation. The ground continued to shift as they moved. More interruptions appeared. At first, they were spaced apart, each one subtle enough to be overlooked. A raised edge here, a flattened surface there, small breaks in the sand that did not follow the natural curves shaped by water. Then gradually, they appeared closer together, not forming a pattern, but no longer entirely separate. Brenna adjusted her steps slightly again, moving across the ground without breaking her pace. Her footing remained steady, though the surface beneath her boots no longer responded in the same way. Edrin paused briefly near one of the exposed edges. The sand had pulled back just enough to reveal a rough surface beneath. It was not polished, not worn smooth. It carried a texture that felt held rather than shaped by the tide. He did not examine it further. After a moment, he continued on, Kayla moved along the edge of another form, her path tracing the line without stepping onto it. The shape extended further than the first, though much of it remained covered. She followed it for a short distance, then let it go. The wind passed over the shoreline again, unchanged. The air held the same quiet weight, and the distant water remained where it had been, neither closer nor further away. Thomas slowed slightly as the ground beneath him shifted once more. A second line appeared, crossing near the first. It did not meet it directly, but the space between them felt measured in a way the rest of the shore was not. He watched it for a moment, then moved on. The shapes did not demand attention. They did not interrupt the stillness. They simply remained, emerging slowly as the sand gave way. The shoreline continued ahead, though it no longer felt entirely open, not closed, only less uniform than before. The group moved through it without pause, their presence unchanged. Behind them, the sand settled. Ahead, the ground revealed itself in small, quiet fragments, and the shapes beneath it continued to surface, not all at once, but gradually, as though they had always been there, waiting for the tide to move aside. The ground beneath them changed fully as they moved forward. The sand no longer stretched in long, uninterrupted sections. Instead, it gave way to a mixed surface where damp earth and exposed stone shared the same quiet space. Brenna stepped onto the firmer ground first. Her footing adjusted without pause. The surface no longer softened beneath her weight in the same way. It held steady, with only a thin layer of sand shifting lightly across it. Edrin followed, noticing the difference in movement. Each step landed more cleanly, with less give. The rhythm of walking remained the same. Kayla slowed slightly as she crossed onto the exposed terrain. The stone beneath the sand was uneven, broken in places, smooth in others. It didn't form a continuous path, but the spacing between each section had narrowed. She stepped carefully, though not cautiously, placing her footing where the surface felt most certain. Thomas remained at the rear, his pace unchanged. The faint glow near him rested softly across the stone. The wind passed over the open ground. The distant water continued its slow, steady rhythm. No one spoke. The transition had not required acknowledgement. It had simply occurred. Brenna moved across a broader stretch of exposed stone, its surface worn but not smooth. Faint lines marked it in places, shallow and irregular. She crossed it without stopping. Edrin paused briefly near a section where the stone dipped slightly. holding a thin layer of water. The surface reflected the sky in muted tones. He watched it for a moment, then continued on. Kayla moved along a narrower stretch where the sand had thinned enough to reveal more of the structure beneath. The edges of the stone were more defined here. She followed the line for a few steps, then stepped away as it faded beneath the sand again. The ground continued to shift as they walked. Stone appeared more frequently now. Thomas slowed slightly as he stepped onto a larger surface. It extended further than the others, though much of it remained covered by a thin layer of sand. He paused for a moment, his gaze moving across its length, then continued forward. The shoreline ahead no longer felt entirely open. The exposed ground created subtle boundaries, guiding their path without directing it. Brenna adjusted her steps once more, moving between the stone and sand without breaking her pace. Edrin followed, his attention moving between the ground and the distant waterline. The distance remained quietly extended. Kayla walked slightly apart, her path tracing the edges where sand met stone. Thomas remained behind, his presence steady, his movement measured. The wind passed again, unchanged, and the shoreline continued to reveal itself beneath their steps. Not suddenly, not completely, only in small, steady portions, as the surface beneath them shifted from what had been hidden to what now remained. The ground settled into a quieter pattern as they moved forward, where stone and sand gave way to shallow pools of water. They appeared gradually. At first, only a few, small and spaced apart, resting in slight depressions where the surface dipped just enough to hold what remained of the tide. Then, more frequently, not clustered, but no longer rare. Brenna stepped between them without changing her pace. The pools did not interrupt her path, only adjusted it slightly, guiding her steps without direction. Their surfaces were still. Each one held a faint reflection of the sky above, softened by the thin layer of water that remained. The light shifted gently across them as the breeze passed. Edrin slowed near one, his gaze lowering. The water was clear, not deep. Beneath it, the stone appeared darker, its texture visible through the surface. Small fragments rested within, bits of shell, fine grains of sand, and something softer that moved only when the water stirred. He watched for a moment, then continued. Kayla moved along the outer edge of a wider pool, her steps tracing the curve without crossing it. The boundary between water and stone was uneven, shifting slightly where the sand had not fully settled. She paused briefly, her gaze resting on the surface. Something moved beneath it. Not quickly, only a small shift, as if something within the pool adjusted to the light. She did not lean closer. After a moment, she stepped away and continued on. Thomas followed last, his presence unchanged. The faint glow near him rested near the edges of the pools without reaching their surface. No one spoke. The pools extended further as they walked. Some were shallow and wide, barely holding water. Others were deeper, their surfaces darker and less reflective. Brenna stepped across a narrow section where two pools nearly met. The stone between them was firm, though worn smooth by the water that had once covered it. She crossed without pause. Edrin followed, his attention passing briefly between the two surfaces of water. They reflected the sky in slightly different tones, though the light above had not changed. He did not linger. Kayla moved along a path where the pools became more frequent. The ground between them narrowed, guiding her steps into a quieter rhythm. She stepped from stone to sand, then back again, her movement steady and unbroken. Thomas paused near a deeper pool. Its surface held less reflection. The water was darker, though still clear. Beneath it, the stone shifted in subtle rises and dips, suggesting depth without defining it. He watched it for a moment, then moved on. The shoreline ahead felt more contained, not enclosed, only shaped by the presence of the water that remained. The pools did not form a path, but they influenced one. Brenna adjusted her steps once more, moving between them without hesitation. Her footing remained certain, even as the ground shifted between surfaces. Edrin followed, his pace unchanged, his attention moving quietly between the pools and the distant waterline. Kayla remained slightly apart, her path tracing the edges where water met stone. Thomas walked behind, his presence steady. The wind passed again across the open ground, and the pools continued to appear in quiet succession. Some held small movements beneath their surface. Others remained still. None required attention. They simply existed within the space the tide had left behind. The group moved through them without pause, their steps measured, their presence unchanged. The ground no longer felt entirely continuous, not broken, only interrupted in gentle, repeating ways. The pools reflected the sky. The stone remained beneath them, and the shoreline continued forward, shaped by water that rested in place. the pools began to thin as they moved forward, leaving longer stretches of exposed stone between them. The ground no longer shifted, only between sand and water. Now it held larger surfaces, broken in quiet intervals, as though separate pieces of something older had remained in place while the tide moved over them. Brenna stepped onto the first broad section without pausing. Its surface was firmer than the ground behind them, though not level. Time and water had worn it unevenly. Some parts dipped slightly, others rose just enough to catch the light. She crossed it with the same steady pace, adjusting only where the stone had fractured near the edge. Edrin followed a few steps behind. The change was easier to feel than to name. The ground beneath him no longer seemed scattered. It held in wider sections now, interrupted less by sand and more by breaks in the stone itself. He looked down briefly as he walked. A narrow line crossed the surface near his feet. Not deep, not sharp, but straighter than the marks left by water. He did not stop. Kayla moved along the outer edge of the same stretch, where the stone gave way to a shallow band of damp sand before rising again a few paces ahead. The second rise was smaller, but clearer. Its edge did not curve with the shore. It held a firmer angle, softened by erosion, but not removed by it. She traced it with her gaze as she passed, then continued forward. Thomas remained at the rear, his pace measured, the faint glow near him resting softly across the ground. The stone reflected very little. It absorbed the light more than it returned it, leaving the surface muted even where it remained exposed. No one spoke. The stillness around them did not change. The breeze passed lightly across the open shore. Farther out, the sea continued its quiet motion. Ahead, more stone emerged, not in one piece, in fragments. Some lay flat and low, half covered by sand or crossed by shallow channels of water. Others rose a little higher, enough to suggest corners or boundaries before fading back into the ground. Brenna stepped between two broken sections, where a narrow seam of sand ran through the middle. The gap was small, but it divided the surface cleanly. She crossed it without breaking stride. Edrin slowed near a fragment that stood slightly higher than the others. Its top had flattened over time, worn smooth at the center and rougher at the edges. A thin line marked one side, as though something once joined there and no longer did. He rested his gaze on it for a moment, then moved on. Kayla reached a section where three low surfaces appeared within a short distance of one another. They did not connect, but the spacing between them felt measured in a way the earlier ground had not. She stepped around the first, across the second, then followed the edge of the third until it disappeared beneath a thin layer of sand. Her movement remained calm, but more deliberate now, shaped by what the ground offered rather than by the open stretch of shore behind them. Thomas crossed after her, pausing only once, where a broken pillar base rose no higher than his ankle. Most of it remained buried. Only the upper ring showed through, worn smooth on one side and broken on the other. He looked at it briefly, then continued. The ruins did not arrive all at once. They revealed themselves in portions, each fragment distinct, each one quiet enough to belong to the shoreline if seen alone. But together, they began to hold a different kind of presence. Not dramatic, only less natural in their arrangement. The pools had become fewer here. What remained of the tide rested in the lower spaces between stone, collecting in narrow channels or shallow basins where the surface had sunk. Brenna stepped over one of these channels, where water lay clear and still between two broken slabs. The stone on either side rose only a little, but enough to hold the water in place. Edrin followed, his attention passing between the water below and the edges that contained it. The shape did not feel formed by chance. He did not linger with the thought. Kayla moved toward a wider section where the stone opened into a rough, flat stretch. The surface there was broken by faint seams and short interruptions, as though several pieces had once met and gradually separated. She slowed for a moment, looking across the length of it, then stepped forward again. Thomas remained behind, his presence unchanged. The faint glow near him rested across the seams without altering them. The lines remained quiet, partial, and unresolved. The shoreline ahead no longer felt defined by tide pools alone. Stone held more of the space now, not continuously, but enough that the ground seemed assembled in places, even where it had fallen apart. Brenna adjusted her footing across another broken section, the movement small and certain. Edrin followed at the same pace. The quiet rhythm of their steps now carried more by stone than sand. Kayla continued slightly apart, moving where edges and surfaces offered the clearest passage. Thomas walked last, measured and still. The breeze moved over the ruins without changing them. Farther out, the sea remained where it had been, and the fragments continued to emerge in steady intervals, each one revealing a little more of what the shoreline had kept beneath the tide. The group moved through them without pause. Nothing required solving. Nothing asked to be named. The stone simply continued beneath their steps, broken, weathered, and gradually more present than the ground they had crossed before. The fragments of stone continued beneath their steps, though the ground ahead began to change again in quiet, gradual ways. The surface lowered. Not suddenly, only enough that the stone no longer remained fully above the ground. Shallow water began to gather across it. At first, it rested in thin layers, barely covering the surface. The stone remained visible beneath, its texture softened by the movement of water passing slowly over it. Brenna stepped forward without hesitation. Her footing adjusted to the change. The surface beneath her boots no longer held completely dry. A thin layer of water shifted as she stepped, parting gently before settling again. She did not slow. Edrin followed, noticing the change in sound more than anything else. Each step now carried a softer tone, the quiet movement of water accompanying the rhythm that had remained steady since the shore. He looked down briefly. The stone beneath the water appeared darker, though still clear in its shape. Faint lines crossed it in places, not deep enough to hold shadow, but present enough to remain. He continued on. Kayla moved closer to the center of the surface. The water gathered more evenly there, forming a continuous layer that followed the shape of the stone beneath. The edges of the surface were less defined now, blending into the surrounding ground where sand and water met. She slowed slightly. A line extended ahead, not raised, not carved deeply. Only a subtle change in the surface, running forward in a steady direction. She followed it with her gaze, then stepped along it without comment. Thomas remained behind, his pace unchanged. The faint glow near him rested above the water without reflecting clearly. The surface shifted too gently to hold it. The line beneath remained as it was, neither clearer nor more hidden as he passed. No one spoke. The path did not require it. It existed within the ground, not separate from it. Brenna continued forward, her steps falling naturally along the same direction. The surface beneath her no longer shifted randomly between stone and sand. It held a steadier form, even as the water moved across it. Edrin followed along the same line, though not precisely. The path did not guide them directly. It only suggested a direction that was easier to move within. Kayla remained closest to it. Her steps aligned more closely now, though not with intention. The ground simply offered fewer interruptions along its length. The water deepened slightly as they moved. Not enough to slow them, only enough that the surface beneath became less immediate. the stone still showed through, though softened by the layer above it. Thomas stepped into the deeper section last. The water reached just above the edges of his boots, moving quietly around them before settling again. He paused for a moment. The line beneath the water continued forward, unchanged. Then he moved on. The surrounding ground remained broken and uneven, fragments of stone appearing and fading at the edges of the shallow water. But the path held more consistently, not fully intact, only more continuous than what surrounded it. Brenner crossed a narrow break where the water thinned and the stone beneath rose slightly. The transition was small, barely noticeable, but it marked the place where the surface had once separated. She stepped over it without pause. Edrin followed, his attention moving between the break and the continuation beyond it. The line resumed almost immediately, as though the interruption had not altered its direction. Kayla traced the same section more slowly. The break was not jagged. It held a softness at the edges, worn down by time and water. She stepped across and continued. Thomas followed last, his gaze resting briefly on the point where the surface had divided. Then forward again. The water remained calm. Its movement did not change. The distant sea continued its steady rhythm beyond the exposed ground. The path extended further ahead, not leading to anything visible, only continuing. Brenner walked within it without adjustment now. Her steps had settled into the rhythm the ground allowed. Edrin followed, his movement quiet, his attention unbroken. Kayla remained near the center, her gaze moving between the surface beneath and the space ahead. Thomas walked behind, steady as before. The water spread slightly wider across the stone. The edges of the path softened where sand met its surface, though the direction remained. Nothing about it suggested purpose. Nothing about it required understanding. It simply continued beneath the water, present in a way that did not change the stillness around it. The group moved along it without pause. Their pace remained the same, their presence unchanged. The ground beneath them no longer shifted between scattered forms. It held in a single, quiet direction, and the path beneath the water remained, extending forward as it had been, neither hidden nor revealed, only continuing where it already was. The path beneath the water continued forward, steady in its direction. though the space ahead began to gather into something more defined. At first, it appeared only as a change in height. The surface rose slightly beneath the water, just enough to alter the way the light settled across it. The line they had followed did not end. It carried into the raised ground without interruption. Brenna stepped onto the higher surface without pause. The water thinned across it, retreating just enough to reveal more of the stone beneath. Her footing adjusted naturally, the surface firmer and less obscured than the path behind them. She continued forward. Edrin followed, his gaze lowering briefly as the water cleared. The stone here held a broader shape, less broken than the fragments they had crossed before. Its surface carried faint seams, running across it in quiet intervals. He did not stop. Kayla slowed as she approached the same rise. The edges of the structure were not sharp, but they held more clearly than the ground behind them. The transition from water to stone felt less gradual, as though the surface had been shaped to hold its boundary. She stepped onto it, her movement steady, her attention resting on the space ahead. Thomas remained behind, his pace unchanged. The faint glow near him rested across the shallow water before settling onto the stone as he followed. The surface did not reflect it fully, but it carried its presence in muted tones. No one spoke. The stillness remained. The breeze passed lightly across the exposed surface. Beyond it, the sea continued its distant rhythm. The structure extended outward, not as a single form, but as a collection of connected surfaces, each one rising slightly above the waterline, each one holding more continuity than the fragments behind them. Brenna moved across the first section, her steps unbroken. The stone beneath her boots held steady, its surface worn but more even than what they had crossed before. She reached a shallow break where a narrow line of water passed between two sections. It did not divide them completely, only marked where they no longer fully met. She stepped across without slowing. Edrin followed, his attention passing briefly over the break. The edges were smoother here, worn down over time, as though the separation had not been recent. He continued on. Kayla moved along the edge of a wider surface. The boundary curved slightly, though not with the natural flow of the shoreline. It held a shape that felt set, even as time had softened it. She traced it with her gaze, then stepped inward again. Thomas followed last, pausing only once, where a section of stone rose just enough to suggest the base of something that no longer stood. It did not form a complete shape, only a partial curve, broken at one end and worn flat at the other. He looked at it briefly, then continued. The structure did not stand apart from the shoreline. It existed within it. The water remained in the lower spaces between the stone, collecting in shallow basins where the surface dipped. Some held still reflections, others shifted slightly where the breeze passed. Brenna moved toward the center of the raised ground. The space opened slightly there, forming a broader surface that extended in quiet directions. It did not form a clear boundary, but it held more continuity than the edges. She stepped across it without changing her pace. Edrin followed, his movement steady, his attention resting lightly on the seams that crossed the stone beneath him. They did not intersect cleanly. They faded and resumed, suggesting connections that no longer held completely. Kayla slowed again near the middle. The surface beneath her feet felt less interrupted. The seams were still present, but spaced further apart, allowing the stone to hold in wider sections. She paused for a moment, then continued forward. Thomas remained behind, his presence unchanged. The faint glow near him rested across the broader surface without altering it. The structure held quietly beneath them, not fully intact, not entirely broken, only present in a way that suggested it had once been more than what remained. The water did not cover it fully, nor did it leave it completely exposed. It rested between those states, shifting slightly as it moved across the lower spaces. Brenna adjusted her steps once more as the surface changed again, the stone dipping slightly before rising in another section ahead. She crossed it without hesitation. Edrin followed, his pace unchanged. Kayla moved slightly apart, her path tracing the subtle shifts in elevation where the structure revealed itself more clearly. Thomas walked last, measured and steady. The breeze passed again. The distant sea remained where it had been. The structure extended beyond them, not ending, only continuing in portions that revealed themselves gradually. The path beneath the water had not led to it. It had simply continued through it. The group moved across the central space without pause. Nothing required attention. Nothing asked to be understood. The stone beneath them remained quiet, holding its shape without definition, and the structure continued outward, neither forming completely nor fading entirely, as though it remained in place without needing to be whole. The structure continued beneath their steps, though the water began to change. At first, it was difficult to notice. The surface remained calm, The stone still showed through in quiet sections. The path they had followed held its direction across the raised ground, but the water no longer rested in the same places. Brenna stepped forward, her pace unchanged. A thin layer moved across the stone where it had been clear before. It did not rush. It gathered slowly, spreading across the surface in a way that did not interrupt her footing, only softened it. She continued. Edrin followed, his attention lowering briefly. The shallow channels between the stone held more water now. Where they had been narrow, they widened slightly, the edges less defined as the surface filled in. He watched for a moment, then moved on. Kayla slowed near the center of the structure. The seams in the stone remained visible, though the water began to settle within them, tracing their paths in quiet lines. The shapes beneath did not disappear, but they softened, their edges less immediate than before. She stepped forward, her movement steady. Thomas remained behind, his pace measured. The faint glow near him rested above the water, its reflection appearing only in fragments where the surface held still. No one spoke. The stillness remained. The breeze passed lightly across the open ground. The sea continued its distant rhythm. The change did not come from a single direction. It spread. The lower sections filled first, the shallow basins and narrow channels, holding more water than they had before. The broader surfaces followed more slowly, a thin layer forming where the stone had been exposed. Brenna crossed a section where the water had begun to gather between two connected surfaces. The gap had been clear before. Now it held a quiet layer that shifted as she stepped across it. She did not slow. Edrin followed, his attention passing between the water and the stone beneath. The line that had guided them remained, though it appeared less distinct now, softened by the surface above it. He continued on. Kayla moved along a section where the water spread more evenly. The ground beneath her steps remained steady, but the clarity of the stone had changed. The details were still present, though they required more time to notice. She did not pause. Thomas stepped into a slightly deeper section. The water rose just above the surface of his boots, moving gently around them before settling again. He paused for a moment. The structure beneath remained, though it no longer held the same sharpness. Then he moved on. The path they had followed did not disappear. It remained within the ground, though its direction was no longer as clear. The surrounding fragments of stone held their place, but the spaces between them filled, reducing the separation that had defined them earlier. Brenna continued forward, her steps guided more by the feel of the ground than by what could be seen. Edrin followed, his movement unchanged. Kayla remained slightly apart, her gaze moving between the surface of the water and the forms beneath it. Thomas walked behind, steady as before. The water continued to rise in quiet increments, not enough to alter their pace, only enough to change what remained visible. The broader surfaces of the structure became less defined as the water spread across them. The seams softened, the edges blurred. What had been revealed now rested just beneath the surface again. The breeze passed once more. The distant sea remained where it had been. The structure extended ahead, though it appeared differently now, less distinct, more continuous beneath the water. Brenna adjusted her steps slightly as the surface shifted again, the change small and unforced. Edrin followed, his attention steady. Kayla continued along the subtle line that remained. Thomas walked last. The tide did not return with urgency. It did not reclaim the shore. It simply moved back into the space it had left. The group moved within it without pause. Their pace remained steady, their presence unchanged. The ground beneath them continued to hold its shape, even as it became less visible, and the water settled across it, not covering it entirely, but softening it into something quieter than before. The water continued to settle across the stone as they moved. The surface beneath their steps remained steady, though it no longer showed itself in the same way. The lines and seams that had once guided their movement now rested just below the water, present but less immediate. Brenna stepped forward without pause. Her footing remained certain, even as the ground beneath her became less visible. The water shifted gently around her steps before settling again, leaving no lasting change behind. She continued. Edrin followed, his gaze lowering briefly. Where the structure had been clearer, it now softened into a continuous surface beneath the water. The breaks between sections no longer held the same distinction. They remained, though they required more time to notice. He did not stop. Kayla slowed near the edge of the structure. The raised ground began to lower again, the stone giving way to a thinner layer beneath the water. The transition was gradual, though it marked the place where the surface began to return to what it had been before. She stepped forward, her movement steady. Thomas remained behind, his pace unchanged. The faint glow near him rested across the water, appearing only where the surface held still enough to reflect it. No one spoke. The stillness remained. The water spread further across the ground. The higher sections of stone became less frequent, their edges fading beneath the surface. The broader spaces that had held their shape now blended into the surrounding ground, losing their separation. Brenna crossed the last of the raised surfaces without adjusting her pace. The ground beyond felt more familiar, the stone less present beneath the water, the surface returning to a quieter consistency. Edrin followed, his attention passing over the place where the structure had been more defined. It remained beneath the water, though it no longer shaped their path in the same way. He continued. Kayla moved along the boundary where the water thinned again. The pools that had once formed ahead now appeared in reverse, their shapes less distinct as the water spread evenly across the ground. She stepped through them without pause. Thomas followed last, his presence steady. The faint glow near him rested across the surface, unchanged. The shoreline began to open again. The waterline, once distant, felt closer now, though it had not moved quickly. The space between land and sea returned in quiet measure, the extended ground gradually narrowing. Brenna stepped onto a stretch where the water no longer covered the surface completely. The sand returned beneath her steps, softer than the stone, settling as she moved across it. She continued toward the shore. Edrin followed, his movement unchanged. The sound of the sea grew slightly clearer as the distance shortened. It did not rise in volume, only in presence, returning to where it had been before. Kayla walked slightly apart, her gaze moving once more across the ground behind them. The structure no longer showed clearly. Only faint variations beneath the water suggested where it remained. She did not stop. Thomas walked last, his pace measured. The faint glow near him remained steady, resting against the softening light of the shore. The breeze moved across the open space. The sea continued its steady rhythm. The shoreline held as it had before. The group reached the edge of the exposed ground without pause. Brenna stepped onto firmer sand where the tide had not yet returned. Her steps left clear impressions again, the surface holding them briefly before softening at the edges. Edrin followed, his attention returning to the quiet rhythm of movement. Kayla moved to the side, her path widening slightly as the open space returned. Thomas stepped onto the shore last. The water continued to rise behind them. Not quickly, only enough that the ground they had crossed began to settle beneath it once more. The pools disappeared into a single surface. The fragments of stone rested beneath it. The path they had followed remained within the ground, though it no longer showed itself. Nothing had changed. Nothing needed to. The shoreline remained as it was. The sea returned to its place, and the ruins beneath the tide settled back into quiet, where they continued as they had before, neither revealed nor hidden, only present beneath the surface. The group moved along the shore, their pace steady, their presence unchanged. The sound of the water remained. The wind passed lightly across the sand, and the tide continued its slow return, carrying the ground back into stillness as the shoreline held its quiet form.